When we speak of civil liberties and civil rights, people are beginning to understand that the most fundamental of these is the right to work in our society. And what is occurring in Guyana is that the government is making political capital out of the indefensible position of one who is either unemployed or is very close to the line of being unemployed.
I want to say to you all in no uncertain terms that this government is disrespectful to black people. And if people disrespect you, you have a right to disrespect them.
I am saying now that we have started, now that we have come together, do not sleep. Don't let us go back quietly into the night. Protest must be the order of the day.
The history of Guyana in the colonial period is that the colonial regime trembled whenever African and Indian workers moved together. And on the basis of that and many other facts which can be adduced, I would say that when African and Indian workers move together, the local exploiting class will have a very short lease of life.
Nobody else can liberate the working class but the working class. Nobody else gives somebody else freedom. Freedom is something for which you fight. really freedom. I say this very deliberately. Not even those of us who stand on this platform can tell you that the remedy in Guyana is that a new set of people must take over from the old set of people, and we will run the system better. That is no solution to the problems of Guyana. The problem is much more fundamental than that. We are saying that working class people will get just only when they take the initiative, when they mold themselves. Nobody else can give it as a gift. Someone who comes claiming to be a liberator is either deluding himself or he's trying to delude the people. He either doesn't understand the process of real life or he is trying to suggest that you do not understand it. And so long as we suffer from a warped concept of politics as being leadership, we are going to be in a lot of trouble.
Workers move together. And on the basis of that and many other facts which can be adduced, I would say that when African and Indian workers move together, the local exploiting class will have a very short lease of life.
And a very good evening to you, and welcome to today's edition of Politics 101, special edition today, June 13th, one of those sacred days in our national calendar, our political calendar. Certainly a sacred day for those of us in the WPA. The day when our brother was cut down, assassinated on a Friday night in the middle of Georgetown, June 13th, 1980. And every June 13th, we remember him. We remember him, Walter Rodney, perhaps Guyana's best known son, best known citizen in the second half of the 20th century. And there's so many Guyanese and West Indians who have helped to shape society and politics for the world in the latter half of the 20th century. Walter Rodney, had he lived, would have been 81 years old today. Well, not today, this year. This year. Today, June 13, we remember him. And those images that we showed there would bring back memories for those who lived through that period. In my own case, I was a little boy. But here we are 43 years later. Some of you, perhaps most of you, were not born in 1980. And there are questions that you're asking, as you must ask. And so what we want to do today is to bring Rodney into the present. Bring Rodney into the present. We quarrel a lot about the past. The kind of society that we have, we don't even agree on what that past was. And Rodney was very much part of that past. Very much part of that past, even when he was not in Guyana. So what we want to do is to bring Rodney into the present, because it's a present that all of us are in the face of. And I remarked in an interview I did with Professor Clive Thomas this morning that somebody like Walter Rodney's contributions, whose praxis was so broad, he engaged us in race and class, nation, society, history, economics, politics, that it's so easy to pull out one aspect of Rodney and make that Rodney. I have been so frustrated these 43 years that I don't think Guyana has had a chance to really digest who Rodney was and who he is, partly because each person who bothers with Rodney, or each force, takes a part of Rodney and use him to justify their narrative. Tonight, I want us to do it different. I want us to point the spotlight on the present. and try to figure out how Rodney fits into the present. Or Rodney fits into the present. Rodney, whether it was in Jamaica or when he was in Africa from 1969 to 1974, or whether he was in Guyana in 74 to 80, one thing we know is that he stood up against oppression. In Jamaica, he would have stood up against racial oppression. As a black man, as an African, in a majority African society, dealing with the question of the African being at the bottom of the ladder. Wanting to teach African history, not being allowed to teach it. In Africa, he engaged the issue of class. There were Africans, black people, in an independent society. And so the issue of race may have receded. And Rodney dealt with the question of social class. And then he came back to Guyana when the issue of the black man had been engaged by EUC Kwayana and ASCREA and some of the other Black Power organizations at the time. And by the time he got back here, the issue was, how do you confront the authoritarianism that had emerged in our Guyana, our Caribbean, and indeed in Africa itself. It was a post-colonial phenomenon. And he had come back to his own country to confront that. Are we in the present, in 2023, still confronting the question of what to do about Black people, what to do about the darkest among us, who would have had a unique experience, historical experience? Are we still dealing with that today? Are we still dealing with authoritarianism today? Are we still dealing with the issue of foreigners trying to rape the resources of a third world country, so-called third world country, post-colonial country? Are these issues which Rodney confronted in various ways in his time, are these issues present with us today? I'm not a historian, and I believe history is so important, very, very important. You walk with your history all the time. And so therefore, I am one who believes that you cannot walk without a rear view mirror. Some people say in politics, you shouldn't use the rear view mirror. I think you should. But I think we are faced always with whether the present is a reflection of much of the past. And so I want to bring Rodney into the present tonight with some of his comrades. Because you see, we in the WPA, and whether you call it a party or a family, we have to deal with something that we don't often pay attention to. That of all the political parties, the left-wing radical political parties, which raised serious questions about our independence in the first decade, all of them sprung up in the late 60s and the early 70s across the English-speaking Caribbean. They call them New Left and Radical Left and so forth. All of those parties, except the WPA, all of them they're no longer active. The WPA is the only new left party that is still active in our region. And so therefore, we have to answer the questions that people are asking of the left today. So today I want us to talk about Rodney differently. I don't want us to use Rodney tonight to fight battles of the 1970s. I'm firm on that, very firm on that. I think we owe it to the younger generation to introduce that man to the younger generation and to explore his possibilities or the possibilities for them in him. There's a time and place for everything. Rodney has been used too much as a political footballing guy, and I'm tired of that. Tired of it. And so tonight we want to have a mature conversation. Introducing Rodney to a new generation in a new time. Guyana is a petrol state. How authoritarianism operates within a petrol state. It's different from how it operated back then. So let's talk tonight. Let's remember Walter Rodney differently. And I have with me three of his comrades here, all of whom are known to you, some more than others. Takumo Ogunse, who needs absolutely no introduction. Lohit Kanai may need some introduction. He's new to our programs, but he is a veteran WPA member. And Nigel Westness, who is not so new to us, also veteran WPA member. We were hoping to have a wider range of WPA members of the WPA family. But for one reason or the other, I denied that range. Perhaps the logic of our survival as a political party itself contributes. Brothers, welcome to WPA Groundings tonight.
Welcome to
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good evening, Dr. Hines, Brother Takuma, Brother Nigel, and to the audience.
And we are going to assume that the audience knows something about Walter Rodney. So we're not going to get into who he was. We're not going to get into the personal reflections. We have done that over time. We're going to go straight to the heart of the matter. In one of the clips, Rodney says, no one can liberate the working class but the working class itself. And I want us to start there. Rodney's thesis of self-emancipation and its relevance to today's Guyana. As we take a look at the political landscape and we see the bearers of gifts going into communities, telling people that they can be emancipated by beads and gifts. How relevant is Rodney's thesis, his praxis of self-emancipation? And I'm going to start with you, because of the four of us here, you knew the man closest, more than the rest of us. You knew him as a brother, as a friend, as a comrade. So I want to start with you. Rodney's thesis of self-emancipation and its relevance to today's Guyana.
Now, I would say that it is more relevant than ever. Rodney's thesis is almost, you could say, a kind of universal thesis that will probably apply wherever working people are. So it goes beyond the boundaries of Guyana. But as it relates to Guyana, I think it is important because at the time of Rodney's activism, okay, we were blessed with a society that was more ideologically oriented, a society where the masses, were, in my judgment, were more attuned with politics in a fairly mature way. And we have had significant experience of electoral parties and electoral politics. And the masses have developed an understanding of the limitations of those institutions. But I think when Rodney came and began to coin the argument that the true liberation of the working people lies in their own self-emancipation and self-liberation, mean their own self-activity, I think it brought a new dimension to the consciousness of the working people and the political movement as a whole. And I think that in today's Guyana, more than ever, this is necessary, even though we probably have a shrinking working class in the strictest sense of the word, but we have a growing poor and powerless who, from all judgment, is part of the working class. And I think the liberation of that section of society which constitute the poor and powerless, which is the greater part of the society, its liberation requires the self-activity. And Walter's call for the working people or ordinary people to recognize the importance that they have to play in their own self-liberation is more relevant today than ever. And I think that those of us who are his comrades have to, press this matter. Because in Guyana, we have reached a point where, the dependencies on, maximum leaders and the manifestation of that phenomenon have placed foremost in the political consciousness of people the need for something different. And I think that is best filled by Walter's argument that the working people have to take on their responsibility for the self-emancipation. So in a nutshell, I think it is more important now than then.
Rohit, I'm going to bring you in here because what may not be known to the wider public and what is known to all of us in the WPA, you are our, what we call Mr. Philosopher, and you always situate philosophy at the center of explanation of social and human phenomena. Rodney's thesis of self-emancipation and its relevance today.
Thank you, Dr. Hines. I was listening to Walter today on race and class, and everything he said, this was just after the referendum, applies to today's environment. Walter was concerned about the growth of a middle class in the post-colonial era. There's a vacuum when a colonial power is being removed. And in Guyana, especially, we did not have a middle class of substance. Bookers, Sprostons, the multinational presence dominated that class structure. Once they were removed, it created a vacuum that the post-colonial state would fill of necessity. And Dr. Clive Thomas, in his work Dependence and Transformation, made the point that in societies like ours, third world societies, the state was an instrument of class creation, as distinct from the developed societies, where the class developed first economically and then took state power. In the third world countries, the opposite phenomenon was taking place. It was political power that preceded economic power. Walter pointed out that that emergent class that will fill that vacuum in Guyana took on a racial profile that clouded the fact that an emergent class was coming into being. Because of a world crisis that we had the privatization and deregulation program, that struggle was deferred in Guyana. The people who went abroad sent a lot of resources back to Guyana, and we survived that crisis. And somehow the economy managed to pull through. But with oil, the transformation now is going to be so naked before us. There's going to be a scramble for resources to build a middle class in Guyana. And the working class will get some crumbs. There's no doubt about that. There will be a movement upward. But the minute we go past that period and things begin to solidify, then the working class will be at a serious disadvantage. Point I'm making in all of this is we are in a dangerous moment.
And how does Rodney's thesis of the self-emancipation of the working people, how does this manifest itself? Is it relevant today? You've given us the historical development, so we are here today now. Situate the thesis of the emancipation of the self-emancipation of the working.
The issue of self-emancipation in today's environment becomes a very serious issue on one hand, but dangerous on the other hand, because of the class movement in society. When that emergent ruling class has the capacity to develop the country, developments
We've lost your volume. We can't hear you.
The emotion of the society is such that the working class will gain some immediate benefits. And that will make the political struggle that more difficult because that immediate benefit will be real. And that's the period we are caught up in right now. Further down the road, the working class will begin to see that this situation will be more polarized. They will be further away from real gains, but they will feel a material gain at this point in time.
Well,
And
okay,
that,
let's bring in Nigel here. Nigel, Rohit has laid out what he sees as the class structure in the society as it emerged over time and where it is now. How does Rodney's thesis of the self-emancipation of the working class fits into that scenario painted by Rohit?
Okay, thank you for having me and my two other comrades here. Both Takuma and Rohit hinted at and directly address certain aspects of your question about self-emancipation. Takuma talks about the new poor and the powerless and the need to embed, need for something different. In other words, bringing self-emancipation into the present. And Rohit has laid out the complex contradictions that will emerge soon enough as the oil economy gets on board. It's starting to get on board. But I just want to, in bearing on your question, I just want to ask the question, what is self-emancipation in the present? And if you look at Rodney's trajectory over time, you'll have, of course, we'll deal with the brothers have already raised the historical context, but I could see the issue of consciousness raising. That is one issue. The second issue would be grassroots organizing. All Rodney, popular education, intersectional or international solidarity, and of course, embedded in what I talked about, grassroots organizing, is the notion that we are a multiracial state. Guyana is a multiracial state. And how do you confront it? You know, Rodney did that in the past. You want to deal with the present. There still is that contradiction of ethnic groups represented by parties, represented in the economy in various imbalanced ways, in which Takuma mentioned in terms of the imbalance, historical imbalance, especially for African Guyanese. And finally, Rodney talked about, as you know, everywhere he went, Dr. Hines mentions Rodney's, in the initial opening, Rodney's movement across the world, Jamaica, Tanzania, everywhere he went, he always moved to the point of revolutionary change. What is revolutionary change? So I would outlay it in that format, that you have to have those components in the concept of self-emancipation. It just can't be abstract. And of course, it will play out differently than the time Rodney is around. We have all kinds of new contradictions, as Rohit and Takuma and yourself mentioned. And we have to, in a sense, if you're acting on Rodney's impulse for self-emancipation, you have to deal with that. How do you project popular education in a multiracial society, given the contradictions of the past and the contradictions in the present? How do you deal with grassroots organizing in a practical way? How do you meet Indian Guyanese directly? How do you meet or update African Guyanese on their own condition and what they faced in the past on the different regimes and in the current regime? All of those things and the contradictions within them are all ripe for new analysis and new action. I think part of the process is to do it rather than to, and I think that was the embodiment of self-emancipation, not think it through. And another component of self-emancipation, of course, is the non-academic format of it. Rodney, as you know, is very famous for his groundings, and he didn't take away the theoretical completely, but he said, the working people must see what are their conceptions in Linden of self-emancipation? What is the conceptions in Andale of self-emancipation? What do you mean by working, as Roy pointed out, in a new world economy? What are the new contradictions? How much immigration do we have in the country? What are the dangers of a new emergent middle class and the struggle for economic gain from the new working class, or the working class is trying to become a middle class, essentially, with wealth. So I would leave it there and try to pivot to what self-emancipation actually means on the ground in the present.
Thank you very much, Nigel, for those two what does self-emancipation mean in today's Guyana? I think that is extremely critical. And secondly, the Rodney praxis of always trying to change the situation that he confronts. You know, as a concretist, he is in Guyana. He engages the concrete situation and tries to effect change from within the context of Guyana, not ignoring that Guyana is part of a region, a hemisphere, and a world. But he was very much a concrete. And so I want to throw that ball over to you, Ogun, and Rohit. First of all, what does self-emancipation and what does it mean in 2023 in a place called Guyana, given all the developments that Rohit walked us through?
No, I think it is hard for me to answer that question. I really would say it is the working people have to answer that, and they have to answer that in their day-to-day struggle to survival and their conscious political struggle. I would say that in today's Guyana, working people are conscious that when they reflect upon their material condition relative to other social groups in the society, they know that they're in a bad place. I will argue that working people see that as an important aspect of the self-liberation project. I will argue that working people, you know, when they reflect upon the experiences, they're very conscious of the racial divide, which weakened them, what is state of the trade union movement, okay, and its powerlessness. And it must be part of the working people's consciousness that the ethnic division is something that has to be addressed. Whether they know how to address it or not is a different issue, but I know that's part of the consciousness that they're struggling with. When the working people look at the economy of the country, and I think both sides, I think the Indian working class who looking at the economy has his own questions. They're seeing the empowerment of the Indian elite, and much be striking to them. They also see the almost absence of African activity in the economy. I think the Indians are very much aware of that, and I deal with Indian people. I'm a market person. And if they could recognize that and ask sometimes me questions, why is it Africans are not in business and so on, why this and that? It is clear that Africans must know that the present situation of being less than 10% in the economy must be an important part of working people's self-emancipation project, as well as the wider African community. So the condition of our young people, our youth, and this cut across race, I think the workers must know, okay, that we are producing a set of young people that you could hardly have any significant confidence that if you close your eyes, they could do better than what you leave them with. I think there's a conscious concern among working people that the quality of young people we're producing, when we become old and pensioners, we think that they will be in a condition to do justice to the society and to ourselves. So I think all of those things constitute, I will argue, the consciousness of the working people and hence the liberation agenda. That's how I will see it. But fundamentally, these things will have to be defined by the working people in their day-to-day struggle and their conscious political struggle.
Rohit, can I? Same question to you.
Consciousness is a day-to-day process of putting food on the table. That is the struggle you cannot escape from. We measure ourselves through the other. We look at ourselves, how we struggle on a day-to-day basis, and look at others like us and ask the question, are we different? What makes us different? And that's a social mirror. As the society moves forward and you look at yourself in relationship to others and you are not progressing, then a serious question has to be asked. What am I doing wrong? Or you may flip it over, what wrong is being done to me that I'm not progressing? It's that self reflection, I think, has to be a serious source of motivation. My big concern is the oil wealth will tend to blur some of this. And if we allow that to happen, then we will lose a vital moment in the struggle. What I mean by this is the consciousness, it's the political parties that will have to imbue into the masses with some clarity what the struggle is all about. I don't think the spontaneity of the masses is such that they will be able to unravel the myriad of forces that Dr. Westmus just articulated. For me to keep track of all the things he said just now was mind-boggling enough. So all I'm saying to you, we're in a dangerous moment that if the consciousness of the masses is not raised by the political forces, we will lose a vital moment.
Nigel, I come back to you because the consciousness of the masses, and you raised the issue of consciousness, and that I have to say was very much part of Rodney's praxis, the whole question of consciousness raising among the masses, so that the masses of people will ultimately have to engage in their own struggles to win their own emancipation. But that consciousness, I hear both Rohit and OG are saying, consciousness is a very important part of the process of self-emancipation, and you introduce that. Are what an OG paints not such a good picture of where consciousness is, especially among the young people. How does the Rodneyite approach break through that, if you will, that tough situation of generations of young people not being, quote unquote, as conscious as they ought to be? How do we use Rodney to break through that?
Well, I have to first be cautious, like Takuma mentioned. You can't answer holistically a question like that. But we're coming off of what
Let me put
Takuma
it
said.
this way. What tools have Rodney left us that
Okay.
we can use today in that process?
Well, I was going there. Yeah. So the issue is that Takuma mentions two things: the young people's future, and if we can look safely, older folks can safely look down and say, hey, we have a confidence that the class question and all of those issues will be handled, political culture will be handled by the new generation of Guyanese. And so if you looked at that through Rodney, when Rodney goes to any society, one of his critical ways he used to do is to listen. When he came back to Guyana in 1974, sorry to go backwards a bit, but to bring the question forward, I have to do that. When he came back to Guyana, he listened to all sectors. He watched, he came back from Tanzania, he was in Jamaica, and he was in Guyana in the early 60s. So he was an interruption. So he came back to hear people out. And what he did was to listen and talk to people. I remember my father taking him in the car. My father was as you know, a PUP person. And he was giving them a lift to a public meeting one time. It was a joint meeting, I think, from all the parties. And Walter had a walking stick, and he was talking very generously about everything, his contacts with people across the site, and his questions. You were asking questions in the car. So he did that with working people. He did that with Lyndon. Brother Stanley was recently passed away. I have an interview with Brother Stanley where he said Walter motivated him because the questions he asked and his responses, Walter took it on board in his analysis. So he didn't just come with a priori knowledge of Guyana and pronounce it. He had to learn from the people. So I would say listen is one aspect of it. But you have to deal with the thing I think that Takuma hinted at and Rohit in a different way hinted at is a question of civic loss. We are not the same society as we were even 15 years ago. Apart from the immigration, there's a lot of political decline and social decline. There's a lot of memory loss in terms of history. 10 years ago, we didn't know you still don't know what happened in the 90s with all of the police shootings and stuff like that. We just heard Smalley get killed. And yet nobody's reflecting on the fact that there was a lot of killings of young black and brown men and women in the 2000s, all the way up to 2012 or thereabouts. That has disappeared from the political consciousness. How do you debate that in a multiracial milieu when a new government is in office and the oil economy is in the hands, as Roy hinted at? So I would say the conscious raising, as Ogun says, has to come from the working people. He made it quite clear that the people have to see what they're going to do, and they will make their own choices. But as Rohit pointed out, this will probably be telegraphed through political parties in the final analysis, because people always go to there's no trade unions, as Takuma mentioned, but a political party entity is still around. And so they will go to that for leadership. And where are they in relation to, I'm talking about the leadership of these political parties, where are they in relation to consciousness raising of the people if they can't even remember a decade ago of what happened to people, or the humanity or empathy? Is there empathy in the society? When I mean empathy, I don't mean passive empathy. I mean active empathy. If something is happening to people, do you act across race? Do you act across political persuasion? How do you do that? Rodney was critical in that. WPA at the time, we dealt with that very fundamentally and brought people into the ranks, because people saw Rodney going to talk to help Alna Rampersad or talk about the sugar workers' problems and vice versa. So those are the things I think we'll have to be in the concept of content. But again, it's very abstract for me. I'm not in Guyana, and it's very inchoate. It doesn't happen in a linear way. As the philosopher will tell you on the program here, it is inchoate. It doesn't, conscious raising doesn't come like magic. It will come in fits and starts, and then maybe it will be revolutionary in form or even retrogressive in form. And there are all those dangers, as Roy pointed out.
Now, if I was just to engage the question of consciousness, you see, there's two levels of Rodney's praxis. The ones that we know about is the ones that is written about. Is the unspoken praxis, which is not being speak about very openly. The party have never agreed to open these archives to the fullest disclosure and discussion. But one of the difference, you see, Walter was also conscious that the society, you can't separate the struggle from the way the society evolved. And he knew that the society will depend upon the political institutions and social institutions, but it also depends upon the charismatic leaders, and leaders is a leader society, charismatic leaders. And he knew that whatever you say, you had to confront the Burnham and the Jagons and what they represent in the consciousness of the people. And politics, whether you like it or not, in Guyanese and West Indian society, that element is important. And he never he understood it. And while he was against, one-manism and the cult of the personality, he knew that the population was looking at the political leaders, both the conventional leaders and unconventional leaders, trying to ascertain something more than the rhetoric, something in the practice as they engage the political situation that make them feel different and that something meaningfully is going to happen. I think the different Walter's success didn't lie simply on his rhetoric. I'm not playing down the strength of the rhetoric, but I think Burnham knew that Walter was not only talking, Walter was influencing key areas of the state institutions, making contacts, shifting, the politics. So it wasn't simple rhetoric, and I think that a lot of times that those efforts are not, those things are not discussed, and the state know where they were feeling pain and where they were feeling losses, both in manpower and materials. This is the furthest I will go.
I'm very
But
glad.
what I'm saying, simply saying that it is an error to present Walter's praxis just at the public meetings, public disclosure, without understanding that a critical element of it, lies with him believing the revolutionary cadre must engage in all aspects of the revolution to make the revolution. And that was felt by the working people in Guyana of all races. They knew something different was here, and the leaders, both Burnham and Jagan, knew with Walter, this is not the typical conventional, electoral engagement. This is something different.
Yeah, I just want to quickly jump in there. Yeah.
Go ahead, Nigel. Go ahead, Nigel.
Yeah, well, that example is perfect. As you know, I teach abroad, and one of the things that Martin Luther King did in the United States context in the 1960s and 50s was that he, apart from the rhetoric, as Kakuma pointed out, Martin Luther King was very consciously going into communities where there was the highest level of contradiction between whites and blacks in terms of the civil rights protests, in order to provoke the sheriff or the governor of the time into action against the people. And when they do that, he would quote unquote gain politically from it. So it's a very conscious effort not to just make the rhetoric, because that couldn't work in America at that time. Martin Luther King went to the people and went to it deliberately. So he had a conscious. People have this notion of King as just some kind of great orator and pastor and peacemaker. No, King was very conscious of it, and I agree completely with what Takuma is saying. Walter's context, he was very conscious, and those people reacted in different ways. I mean, the state at the time, the Burnham, and the opposition, the big opposition to WPA in different ways because they saw something different. I think he's completely accurate about that.
Yes. I completely agree with that. And CLR James has this thing about time, place, and person. That part of what generates that kind of charismatic response. And people see charisma as a one-way thing, but it's really a two-way thing. It is the people believing that the leader has a certain kind of legitimacy. And so it is not just the leader responding to the people, but the people also responding to something that you sometimes can't explain. So James has this thing about the person and the time and the capacity of the person to assume and accept the energies of the people. And I think part of explaining the Rodneys of this world is the time, the place, but also having the capacity to take the energies of the people and turn it into something larger than it is. And something is playing on my mind there, and I want to throw it out there because I've talked about it a couple of times since Sunday. I went to a funeral in my village, and it's one of the boys that got killed that went on the thing with Smalley. The one that got killed that they said he cocked the gun. He's from my village and so on. And he was buried on Sunday, and I went to the funeral. He's from the back of the village, and those of us who know villages and how those villages have emerged, what the back of the village meant. And I went to the funeral, and the first thing that struck me is the number of young people at the back of that village. This is my village. I go there all the time, but I have no idea. And I am asking myself where they fit, where they live, how so many of them live at the back there. But that's not the point. The point is, to my utter surprise, most of them recognize me. And some of them were bold enough, especially the young, the guys give you the fit bump, but the young women were bold enough to come up and talk to me. And they made clear, in one instance, somebody was saying, yes, there's an APNU man. And the other girl next door lashed around and said, no, there's a WPA man. Blew me away. These are kids. They're not scholars and school, but they're poor. But they went on to give me some advice. And part of the advice is the question of power, how you deal with power. And then they ask me, what about the 5,000 US dollars? No, I'm blown away, because here we talk about young people who don't have the kind of consciousness. But here it is that they are revealing things that surprise me as a political activist. That kind of information and recognition, that I put it down to the fact that I'm from Buxton, and if they're scrolling on Facebook and they see me, they will stop and so on and so forth. But then something tells me it may not be as simple as that, and so I want to throw that out to you all, and to speak to that within the context of the whole Rodney practice. Who do I start with? Rohit.
David, I want to change the topic slightly.
Don't change it slightly. Address that question, and then we're going to go and change it.
No, I'm saying,
yeah,
when I grew up in the 1973 period downward, we were moving from a series of one crisis to another to another. It was a quest for survival. The question I want to pose today is, what constitutes the family aspiration today in Guyana as we speak? I mean, everything comes down to, how do I raise a family? What are my hopes and aspirations for my children? It starts to give us some perspective. What is it we're talking about? We talk about oil money, we talk about everything, but what is the core of this all? It's the family. How does the family hold itself together? How does the family prepare for a future that it looks forward to? Now, given all the political problems, the issue of oil money and all these things, if you are a family man, how does my family and my future fit into the discussion we're having?
Right. All right. OG, and we'll come back to that, Rohit. OG and Nigel, if you can engage that little anecdote that I gave there against the context of the consciousness that we're talking about.
No, Buxton is a particular place, and the back of Buxton got a history. But I think what you see in Buxton is also a wider manifestation in the African Guyanese community, and I think the entire Guyanese community. But I'm being careful not to speak like I'm an authority on the Indian community and the Amerindian community. I'm totally not in connection with the Amerindian community, and for years I've been really outside the Indian community, and I'm being very careful here. So my remarks will be more on the African young people. Now, we have to judge consciousness at every historical stage is a little different than the previous stages. Okay? And while I will argue that our young people are not as political as our older people in terms of ideology, commitment to party, and see their activity as important, and so they have new forms of consciousness and new forms of understanding their reality and the reality in the society. They know exactly what is going on in Guyana. Young people in the African community, and I almost certain the Indian community, understand all the problems in Guyana. What is lacking in Guyana, I mean, it doesn't restrict only to young people. It's how do I or we change it? That is the issue. It's not a deficit in lack of information. It's a deficit in an understanding of how to change the reality. And since they don't know how to change the reality, it is not reflected in their behavior, okay, as positive political consciousness, because they're not engaging in it positively as a political action, but they're engaging as a social consciousness. And I'm going to tell you, if I were to, I don't want to divert, but if I were to take your experience in Boston, and I heard you on the program, where young people said they ain't going to vote. What the young people were saying, we know there's other options. You aren't telling me what the other options. You are telling me what options we are trying for 60 something years. And we know the limitations of those options. So it's not that they're interested in politics because they're following the political thing. But they're saying, y'all are ready yet. We understanding what is necessary, y'all in there. And that's how I will answer it. And I think it's true in the Indian community too, with some slight variations. But I want to be careful with what I say about the Indian community, because I don't want to sound like I'm playing authority on that community when I was excluded from it for at least the last 10 years in a real way.
And the reason I'm laughing, Ogun, is that part of the story I couldn't say publicly what they tell me about what the possibilities. I couldn't say that publicly, but you're right. They're very clear about that. Yeah, Nigel.
Yeah, well, it's the same thing that it's the same reflection of the period when Rodney was active. Going back to your point about the Rodney impact. I think Takuma may have mentioned it. Takuma, there's several levels of Rodney's impact, and when I was conscious of when I was active in that period of time when I was in a party that was promoting free and fair elections, against a referendum, public protest, but there was a sense that people were also knowing that WPA was more than that, and it's not expressed in any public way. It just gravitated because they say, oh, these people mean they're serious. And I couldn't put my finger on it at that time. I was pretty young. And I see it replicated now in your representation of your interaction at Buxton and Takuma's clarification of what it really means, that people are quite conscious, but there's no organized movement in all political parties or pressing political parties or going through the trade union movement like in the old days. But there are always other ways of struggle, and they're articulating it or not articulating it because it's a dangerous level. And so I agree completely that there will be many divergent kinds of responses by young people to the crisis. Again, I'm not on the ground, so I can't speak the way David has spoken or Takuma spoke to the issues of how people think across the races, and of course, in this specific case, African Ghanaians. But it's a very important point of how consciousness works. It doesn't work like Walter Rodney in Jamaica, for example. No, there's no formal education. He went to Rastafari. Rastafari gave him a lot of hell. They would, cuss him out about, with respect, cuss him about his, his academic stuff. They know about Ethiopia and region, but the connection was there, and they understand poverty and the poor and the powerless while they were contradicting him. So it's different angles to the issue.
Yes, and I'm glad we went there, because even as we're talking about consciousness in young people, as Ogun say, people develop consciousness different in different era, and they have something now that Rodney didn't have and the young people back then didn't have, and that is this social media story. I mean, you're talking about close to 2,000 people live watching us here, and you don't know who they are. Right? Even when you're seeing their names, they're so proficient. They give themselves aliases and so on. And but you know they're here. And before the night is out, as they scroll through their phone, several times that would come into contact with what we are discussing here. Listen, there was PPP back in Rodney time. There was PNC and there was WPA. There is PPP today, there is PNC, there is WPA today. Perhaps not in the same manifestation as they were 40, 50 years ago. I'm amazed that people say, look what the WPA has become, you know? Um, and some of these same people don't say, look what the PPP has become, or look what the PNC has become, because all three of those organizations, political parties, have changed considerably. We are talking about going on to 4 and 5 decades. So part of the problem of trying to situate, Rodney, in my mind, is you still have these formations that are part of the political process. And of course, we know people who have loyalties, party loyalties, racial loyalties, etc., etc. And sometimes it's very difficult to carry on a really lucid conversation as we are trying to do it without the party loyalty or the ethnic loyalty um, getting in the way. And so I'm asking you all this hard question. Rodney's gone 43 years, so he doesn't have to deal with these three parties still here today in the context of oil. How how do we how do we in this context try to clear the way for the present generation? Um, uh, 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 in the context of these old parties being still around. In many regards, they've changed, but in many regards, they have not changed. Um, how do we advance the change that Rodney was always thinking about change? How do you advance change when you have these all the parties still around? Nothing, not as I said, they may have changed, but how do we effect change in such an environment? Roy, I'll come back to you first again.
Well, I was touching on what Walter was about, the personal touch,
Uh-huh,
the family.
uh-huh,
That was where I was going with
uh-huh,
the family.
uh-huh.
Walter was a family man.
Yes.
Walter, despite all his achievement, was a family man first and foremost.
Uh-huh.
And it is that human touch. What is oil? Oil is just a thing. When we talk about oil, what we are speaking about is how do we transform our society into a human society. Oil is a means towards an end.
Right.
So I remember Walter coming out from the center and putting his arms around me, my shoulder, and said, Rohit, we need to struggle together. And that embrace will never ever leave me. But I'm saying it's the human touch, the humanity.
Mhm. So now
That
let's come to these three political parties, which were in many regards defining that moment, that Walter moment. Walter's gone; he's dead. He's been murdered, assassinated, and we are dealing with this new petro state, and all the contradictions that come with it. How do we push forward when you have these, um, whether you call them competitors, enemies, whatever? How do we move forward?
the petro state has dynamics of its own that we haven't even thought through as yet.
Uh-huh.
First of all, we have to look at the $5,000 issue. We have to define who is a Guyanese, who is entitled to it. We have to begin to draw boundaries. When we begin to draw those boundaries, then we'll realize that Guyana borders are wide open.
Mhm.
It's now going to attract people to participate in the economy, which is quite normal in the world in which we live. How are we going to, if you look at the Arab states, they have some draconic measures to prevent the oil money from going across into people who are not deemed citizens.
Yeah.
I don't know how we will address that. You go to the Arab territories, your passports are seized. You only males can marry and their wives become citizens. The female side, it doesn't happen. So in an oil economy with open borders, you will have to start closing your borders in many ways.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
The
Yeah. Go ahead.
political
Finish the thought.
equation in Guyana is going to be affected by our borders. We will be getting a lot of people, which becomes a question of voting. There was a discussion with Clive when you the Caribbean, we're part of the Caribbean. We will attract people from the Caribbean. Our demographics will change. So there will be defensiveness from one side of the community against the other side of the community. We had this before, 1 into 10, the famous Williams equation becomes 0. So I'm saying we are going to be bombarded at so many different levels that we haven't even thought through this thing as yet.
Right.
And it is just racing at us at such a level that it's difficult to put it all together.
Yeah, yeah. OG, can you come in on the overpowering presence still of these political parties and how we effect the kind of change that we think is necessary, or we will not effect the change, but encourage the change that we think is necessary within the context of these three old parties? Yes. So.
Now, I will say it may not be by chance that 4 decades after, these are the three parties that are still standing. It may be something bigger than just coincidence of history. And my own sense is that we're lucky. Because I believe if Guyana is to save itself, it is our generation working with these three parties, regardless of what we think about them, that have to fashion a solution. Because if we fail to do it, I don't want to even imagine what will happen. So I think that objectively, the future of Guyana, because we're not the PP ain't going to disappear tomorrow, the PNC going to disappear tomorrow, and neither the WPA. Therefore, there has to be some accommodation. Okay, I'm not talking as party, as distinct from the people. There has to be some accommodation among these three political parties and some consensus of what is in store for Guyana. There's some issues that has to be dealt with at the highest levels of your political intellect. And there's some that have to be dealt at the wider society. But we're excluding the wider society for the moment in this part of the discourse. I think we reach at a juncture with oil and everything else that there has to be a meeting of minds of Guinea's leadership, political leadership, as is reflected in these three parties at the present moment. Bornham is not here, Jagan is not there, Walter is not here. It is who here. And we have to decide, based upon all our intellectual knowledge, all our experience about the world and oil and everything I wrote is pointing to, how is it we're going to give Guyana a chance to survive, and how Guineans will benefit from this oil discovery. Because in the oil equation, Guyana could disappear. I have no doubts that foreign powers and so have their plans for Guyana. While, we on the coast still fighting our ethnic and narrow political struggles, I think the shapers of the world, understanding the resources that are at play here, have a solution to Guyana. Less than 1 million people could always be replaced in 20 years as this economy will develop. As the other sector of the economy develop, we have more people, we need more labor. And I'm sure the planners of the world know that they're going to continue y'all stupidness on the coast and so y'all go wake up one morning and see We call the elections, and the foreigners outnumber you. The foreigners got 2 million, you only got about 750,000. One man, one vote, and they're done with you. Now, I think those are the real problems now facing Guyana. Embedded into that, we have to look at the economy of Guyana, which is putting a lot of pressures on national unity. You can't have an economy where Africans and Amerindians only probably together own 10% of this the economy, and the other ethnic groups own the rest. And Africans are about half of the population, you know, I'm talking about exact terms, but it's a big chunk of the population. That equation itself has to be addressed. You also have to come to grips in a country like Guyana that Africans were deprived of 250 odd years of a generational wealth slavery, you know, and our economic situation is a reflection of that historical denial. Therefore, with oil money and so, the state must commit to use oil money consciously and deliberately to correct historical injustice so that Africans don't have to be too worried. We know we got a state is committed to address this. Americans don't have to worry. A state is committed. Indians know wherever they got deficiency, the state is committed to address it. So if we reach that level of political understanding, okay, that these are the measures that is necessary for Guyana to survive. Political power has to be shared at the executive level. Okay, we end the winner-take-all politics, and we guarantee our people the racial competition and struggle is a thing of the past. Now, it is these gigantic but important steps that has to, in the first place, be addressed by the political leaders in great honesty. I'm going to move quickly so that others could come in. But given what we know about the political leadership, the problem in Guyana is that there has been an unspoken agreement between the two major political parties, starting with Burnham and Jagan. You don't attack each other leaders and the top leadership. We can attack the support base and so on, so we play games, but the top is being insulated, okay, from political attacks. If you watch a country like Venezuela, opposition leaders at the highest levels in jail, and the ruling government know that if the opposition come in, their leaders at the highest going to be in jail. So in Venezuela, the class struggle, the political struggle, okay, have reached a point where it's not simply being reflected simply by what happened among the ordinary working people, but the ruling elite is fighting among themselves. In Guyana, the PNC and the PPP have been able to hold on to the Burnham-Jagan formula, and they are able, okay, to make sure that they don't fight too much among themselves, and in fact, they develop economic and all other kind of levels of cooperation. So, and they play the working people, you know, they play the working people. And the working people's consciousness have not reached a point where they could force the society into a political situation where the ruling elite on both sides, the African and Indian elite, in the PNC and the PPP and outside them, who in the economy, feel threatened by the political developments in the country. And until we could shift the politics in a way that really those interest groups feel threatened, that look, before we all lose, let me share and find a solution, you don't get nowhere. So I'm saying in closing, we're lucky that we have, for now, dealing with these three. We know them. We know new forces will come, but we're supported by all kinds of interests. We might be okay, but for the time being, we're lucky we have these three. They all have enough experience about the country and must have a sense of the future. And it is necessary for us to force them into a solution, bring the country to a halt and force them into a solution, or we fight it out. That is the only way to solve Guyana, to avoid the negatives of the oil course. You have to fight this problem now. Don't wait 5 and 10 years when the oil course and the contradictions of oil money consolidate. We got a narrow point. And personally, I was hoping that we could have used the local government elections to trigger that reality, but that is something else. Sorry to even introduce it. But the point is, we have these three parties. The solution for the moment lies in them working out some solution, and three, it lies in the working people and the militants who committed to the working people, force these ruling classes into a political situation where their own security is threatened, not only the security of the ordinary people.
Nigel Westmus.
Yes, bearing off of Takuma, I would say one of the embodiments of the period we were talking about in the past and into the present, the difference between the parties, all of the parties at some point had a sense of political culture, but I think WPA introduced a new kind of political culture into the system, which led to changes led by not by Walter Rodney, but by others who came before him. UC Quinn and Moses Bagwan, for example, meeting to break the racial tension in society. And so I would say, in agreement with Takuma, that the political culture has to be present. And the only force currently now that can force it into parts of those two behemoths, the PNC and the PUP, is parties like the WP and parts of civil society. And that is the only way we can get that consensus. And we have track records of the past. A lot of people don't tell you. I mean, it's not public knowledge, but it's there. The PNC and the PUP had discussions in 1975, 76 at Belfield House, after the rigged elections of 1973, towards a national front. It failed. When WPA pressure in the 1980s forced Hoyt to open national dialogue to discuss where to go forward, and led to elections of 1992. You have instances of people making the creation of APNU in the 2000s, and the other formations showed a level of breaking with the past and coming into a new dimension. Now all of them have weaknesses, and we know the weaknesses into the present. And the question of political culture, the dialectical, I would sum it up like this. Takuma made the point very well, but I'll sum it up. There has to be a dialectical tension between protests, exposure, political culture, national unity, and of course, respect must come from all of that. And Takuma says, essentially says, respect of all forces with the oil money must be in there. What we have now is a situation where, as we could see in this current elections, attempts to buy voters and that creates a level of disrespect to a particular group, especially in the context of the history that Takuma talked about of buying people rather than embracing them and discussing what they need in terms of bringing it forward. You don't have to agree with them, but you could show a level of empathy and respect that could even gain you benefit. That I don't understand how a state doesn't understand that. That being, quote unquote, that we see it in the normal parlance, being nice doesn't mean being weak. It means you're strengthening yourself. And so far, the political forces, apart from the WPA, have not reached that point. And we need to get to that point. And Walter Rodney was the embodiment of that point.
Of that. And I can't end this program without asking for your comments on something that I think is happening in the society that we have not been paying as much attention to. Well, I don't mean we close to the WPA, but the wider civil society. You all have made the point here about the condition of African Guyanese. It's very, very clear, despite all the protestations, that African Guyanese, the condition of African Guyanese is very central. The way in which they have been disrespected. This last election here, there was no campaigning in the other ethnic communities. It was in the African Guyanese community, and that's instructive. And the same time, you notice an attempt to ghettoize Walter Rodney, reflected by a column in one of the papers today. A way in which Rodney is now ghettoized as a racist African, and so you have the disrespect and the marginalization of the African Guyanese community, and now you have Walter Rodney being ghettoized as a racist. Ogunse, start off by telling us what's happening there.
No, I think it's a consequence of a shift that took place in Indian politics. And as I said elsewhere, I remember Indian Guyanese comrade who have been very close to WPA in the early days and very helpful to us. He's a business person. And I don't want to, I haven't spoken to him for many years. I don't even know if he's still in business, and I don't really want in this spiteful atmosphere. But I remember in 1990, we prepared for the 1992 elections, or it was just after the 1992 elections, but we had a meeting at Kitty Market, and he looked for me and he pulled me in the car and he said, "Oh, gee, let me tell you something. I there in New York with them elements. You know," he said, "Jagan, you know what he's saying on to?" He said, "Them elements very racial and racist." He said, "Yeah, black people in this town, in this country, are in trouble." And that was that struck me. I was very instrumental in my examination of PPP behavior because I knew the comrade and I know he didn't lie. And he was bringing to my attention a real reality. This is to say that I think that the new forces that came in 92 that supported Jagan and the PPP and raised funds and so, and to lobby for them in North America and elsewhere, they brought with them a kind of political ideology and culture which was really unknown in Guyana. It is something close like how the Jews behave, you know? And I think that what we're seeing, okay, over time is that culture has become more aggressive, okay, and as the Indian dominance, both in the economy and the politics of the country strengthen, they get more brazen. And they believe that they could assert these kinds of attacks on Africans, and particularly now on Walter, with the knowledge that given their control of the media, where they're attacking you, you can't get no response from the media. Mm-hmm. So they're basically cowards, bullies, but are cowards. They're not even interested in fear, even though they're propagandizing, they're not interested in fear exchange of views. They're hiding in the safe heavens, which you know you can't respond to. Okay? So the attack on Walter, okay, is deliberate, okay, and it is a way, by extension, attack on WPA. You see, a lot of them are marveled of the survival of WPA because they know, in material terms, we don't have the financial base to survive. We should not have been here. And many of them believe if we were not here, they had to make mincemeat of the PNC and mincemeat of the African community, and they would have achieved the objective long before now. They see the WPA as a stumbling block to whatever is their machinations. And they see an attack on Rodney because Rodney is still respected in the Indian community among the elderly Indians. I can't make a judgment to what extent he is respected and known about in the young Indians. But in the elderly Indians, they have great respect for Rodney, and by extension, it plays to the benefit of the WPA. And I think they're trying to erase that. And they feel that they have enough political power, economic power, and control of the media. The only difference is the social media, where you all have been able to develop a counter media that is really creating problems to them. So that is how I will explain it. It is part of the organized and unorganized, okay, attempt by Indian forces, you know, for ethnic domination. I think that is very much on the cards.
Rohit, can I?
I'm dumbfounded, David. Could you develop that a bit for me? What attack could they make on Walter?
Well, we don't have time. We almost run out of it. You obviously didn't read the column today by a certain columnist. We don't have the time to really develop it. But it is something that has been going on. It started with the attacks frontal attacks on the UC Guyana, and now it has shifted to Walter Rodney. Nigel Westmus?
Oh yeah, I was going to say I wasn't sure about what the I think, but I kind of get you know, I haven't read that particular media house for a long time because under both regimes it was dominated by censorship. You can't even send a letter to them. So I would just evade reading it until somebody draws my attention to it. So I understand where you're coming from, but I think that is part and parcel of the dismantling, as Takuma mentions, of the Rodney president. They really only want Rodney for convenience. That is the convenience of saying, "Hey, we have co-opted the multiracialism of WPA in a crude way, but we can't say it that way, so we have to hide under the veneer of Rodney." But the social forces that Takuma mentioned that have emerged, I made a point to somebody recently that I can deal with the old PP folks who have a certain level of struggle in that period with Rodney and ourselves towards a political end. And they have a certain kind of level of political culture. We have disagreements, but at least you can deal with them. But the new formation in this, supported by the diaspora, are very, as Takuma mentioned, very racist and also very anti-Rodney in a certain ways. And so I'm not surprised by that particular attack. It's been going on before, even during the Walter Rodney Commission of Inquiry. If the same columnists you're talking about made a fierce attack on the Rodney family and everything else about that Commission of Inquiry. So I'm not surprised. Yeah, and it has to be dealt with, but they have their own weaknesses. And those can be opened up.
On June 13th, Rodney is declared as anti-Indian.
Oh my goodness.
And that is not anti-Indian today. He was always anti-Indian.
I can't believe that.
But that's where we're going. And I think there are dynamics in the society that's happening that as political people, we have to really, really, really be on top of. I think this was a wonderful discussion. I think we've been able to, in my mind, have a discussion about Walter Rodney without getting entangled in the political fights that we had in the past, and trying to free that brother from the stranglehold that Guyana's ethnic and party politics have gotten him into. So I want to thank you all for coming on tonight and for contributing to this discussion, and to all Rodneyites and all Guyana. June 13th will remain a very sacred day in our political calendar, not just because Walter Rodney was assassinated on that day, but because it reminds us every year of unfinished business as far as the real freedom of our country is concerned. Whatever you say about Walter Rodney, he gave his life. He gave his life. One WPA comrade told me this morning, who was close to him, said he knew that he could have been killed anytime. He never ran away. He gave his life to bring about change in Guyana, and that's why we're all here. Thank you all very much. Takuma Ogunse, Rohit Kanai, and Dr. Nigel Westmus. Thank you all for staying with us. It's not always easy to have this kind of discussion, and in our divisive political environment, to talk about someone who belonged to one party, belonged to one tendency, but at the same time was himself above or transcended the political party differences. Belonging to a political party, but transcending those differences is not always an easy discussion to have in the presence of Guyanese. And I thank you all for staying with the discussion tonight, and from your comments that some of you, if not all of you, did appreciate what we attempted to do. Tomorrow night I'll be back, and no doubt we'll talk a little bit about the morning after those local government elections. So see you all tomorrow.
And when we speak of civil liberties and civil rights, people are beginning to understand that the most fundamental of these is the right to work in our society. And what is occurring in Guyana is that the government is making political capital out of the indefensible position of one who is either unemployed or is very close to the line of being unemployed.
I want to say to you all, in no